Hello everyone, my name is Ken Fickler. I'm the founder and CEO of Gaze, and this video is going to be the long follow-up to the question of how long can you test positive for marijuana on a drug test. So this is a very complex issue, and the answer is it depends on which test you're using. Marijuana testing is extremely commonplace for many workplaces, and in the case a police officer suspects that you could be driving while impaired. Not all cannabis tests are created equal though. They have massively variable windows in which THC, which is the impairing molecule of cannabis, and its metabolites may be detected. Now this causes obvious problems, particularly in states where cannabis is legal. Formerly, an officer or an employer could simply test for the presence of THC or THC metabolites and know that a crime or a workplace safety violation has been committed. In states where cannabis is legal, though, that's no longer true. Police officers and business leaders in those states must instead show that an individual is actively impaired in order for a crime or a policy violation to have been committed. So if you're being tested for impairment by the police, the most important thing to know is that there is no amount of THC that has been correlated to a predictable level of impairment. Said another way, there is no scientific basis for being charged with impaired driving based on a THC test. The only valid ways to detect active marijuana impairment are a drug recognition expert evaluation or impairment detection technology like Gaze. Some states have attempted to instate per se limits for the amount of THC that can be in the body before someone is considered to be impaired. Now these are not based on any scientific evidence, and there has been many scientific studies that have looked into this issue and all found that there is no amount of THC that is predictive of impairment. Most states that have these laws are now reconsidering them. For businesses, it's even more challenging as they have no tool other than Gaze and other impairment detection technology providers to defensively detect active marijuana and other drug impairment. So which type of test for cannabis is best? And the answer to that question is entirely dependent on the reason for testing. Now we're going to explore each of the common types of cannabis tests and impairment detection technology like Gaze, and you can decide for yourself which is better for your use case. So first up, urinalysis THC metabolite testing. This is the most common type of test for marijuana. It's been used for many, many years, and millions of these things are done every month. So THC metabolites are discoverable in urine for at least 4 to 6 weeks since the last use. We have heard that there are many cases in which THC metabolites have been discovered for upwards of 4 months since the last use. So don't necessarily take that common detection window as the only time in which you can become positive. Urinalysis drug screening uses urine from the test subject to detect the metabolic markers of cannabis use. This type of screening is commonly used for workplaces, although many states do not any longer allow for adverse action to be taken based on the presence of THC metabolites in the body. This testing is very invasive. You're giving someone your urine. Often test administrators are required to observe the urine coming out of your body. So that's an uncomfortable experience for everyone. Those tests typically cost $80 to $400 depending on how many drugs you're looking for, whether or not you need clinical results, and it can take between a day and several weeks for that result to be returned. Next up is blood THC testing. So THC in blood is usually discoverable for up to 7 days, although it has occasionally been found for up to 4 weeks since the last use of cannabis. Blood tests for THC and other drugs are commonly conducted by law enforcement and much less commonly conducted by businesses. They are very accurate, but they're much more costly. And so they can detect the presence of drugs like THC as well as many other drugs that can be in your body. These tests cost usually several hundred to over $1,000 to conduct because you need specially trained personnel, special lab equipment and all that. Blood tests must be captured by a trained phlebotomist. It can't be done by anybody. And the results typically take a few days to a few weeks to be returned. We've heard that some testing labs are very backed up. For example, in Canada, we've heard that it's taking upwards of 6 months to get results of a test in order for someone to be given a driving under impaired citation. This testing is typically conducted only when a crime has been suspected, like driving while impaired or in the case of like a workplace death. Importantly, there is no scientific backing for testing some amount of THC in the blood and determining that someone is impaired. Again, there is no scientific backing for that whatsoever. So while most cannabis users will not have detectable THC in their blood for after 7 days since they last used, there are studies that show that you can be detected, the THC can be detected in blood for up to 33 days was the longest I found. So saliva and oral fluid THC testing is up next. And these are very common tests for the workplace. They're quick to administer, relatively accurate depending on the technology being used, although there are many tests that can deliver false positive rates upwards of 15%. So make sure that you're not only relying on a saliva test and are actually doing a confirmatory test if you're going to be dismissing someone for failing that. Now, THC is usually discoverable for about 48 hours since they last used, although there is a study that shows that it was found for 8 days since the last use, and so the idea that these are recent use tests is pretty incorrect, actually. And so for states that are deploying saliva testing for roadside tests, it's important to know that these are not recent use tests. You are going to be positive for 48 hours, so use cannabis accordingly. It's a very difficult position for legal cannabis users to sort of always be facing the prospect of a DUI even when they're safe and sober. So be sure to contact your legislators and make them aware of this. Saliva THC tests are common in both workplace and law enforcement. They use a small amount of saliva on a collection card to detect trace amounts of certain drugs, including THC. These tests are not typically selective to THC versus CBD because of the small amount of THC that can be present in CBD, up to 0.3%. And so if you're a CDL driver, you need to know that it's not safe for you to be using CBD or other hemp products because of that possibility that there is going to be a small amount of THC in there. So be aware of that and don't do it. There's been many CDL drivers that have lost their license and job because of this. Saliva THC tests are, as I mentioned, pretty notorious for having a high rate of false positives, and so they should not be relied upon exclusively and should be followed up with a more specific test. And the advantage to THC tests is they can be conducted quickly and in pretty much any environment with results, preliminary results, presumptive results in around 10 minutes. So like blood tests, no amount of THC in saliva has been correlated with impairment. That's just a full stop. There is no amount of THC that can predict the amount of impairment that you're experiencing, if any. As I mentioned, there was a study that found that THC was detectable in oral fluid for up to 8 days since the last use, and so that's really problematic for habitual cannabis users because many states, I think 27 states right now, have the ability to conduct oral fluid testing and provide that as evidence of potential impaired driving. So very problematic legislation there. Breath THC screening and the idea of a marijuana breathalyzer. So these are new. There's one company that's on the market currently as of the time I'm recording this. Typically, THC is going to be discoverable in the breath for 3 to 5 hours since the last use. It only works for smoked or maybe vaporized cannabis, though. There's no study that I've found that indicates that THC breathalyzers are effective for edible cannabis. THC breathalyzers are condensing a breath sample and looking for minute traces of THC in that. One interesting thing to note is that there is 12 million times less THC in a breath sample than there is in a comparable alcohol sample for someone who's been drinking alcohol. So these are extremely small amounts of THC that these systems are looking for, and they have to be extremely sensitive and are therefore extremely expensive as a result. And these are still mostly unproven technology. There is some science behind showing that THC in breath could be useful, although there are studies that have also shown that recent cannabis users were not found to have THC in their breath, and that the THC in the breath persisted for longer than the manufacturers of these breathalyzers are claiming, so up to 12 hours since they was last used. That's really problematic, of course, if you're a safe and legal cannabis user. Say you use cannabis on a Sunday, you go to work on Monday, you could still fail a THC breathalyzer, and that's a really big problem for employees. Again, I'm going to say it again because it's really important. There is no amount of THC in the breath that has ever been correlated to a predictable level of impairment. These are more recent use tests, but they are not perfect, and they do not tell you if someone is experiencing impairment. There was a great study that came out at the end of 23 that showed that medical cannabis users do not experience cognitive impairment when using their prescribed cannabis according to how it was prescribed. So that is, their tolerance is such that they do not experience the high that you would expect from a cannabis user, and instead were cognitively normal according to a variety of tests. The results of THC breathalyzers are typically not as fast as you might like or might think. This is not like an alcohol breathalyzer where you're getting an answer moments later. You are condensing a breath sample, you're shipping it to a lab, and you're waiting typically about 48 hours for that lab to turn that around and get you a result. So it is not as quick as you might hope. Next up is hair follicle and fingernail drug screening. So THC is discoverable in hair follicles and in fingernails for 3 to 4 months since the last use. Hair follicle tests are typically only used by employers and are usually used as a pre-employment test. So if an employer hires you, they want to find out what your drug habits are, they may put you through a hair follicle test or a fingernail test to find out what drugs you're using over time. These typically cost a few $100s to run. They take 1 to 2 weeks to get the results back, although there are more instant or rapid hair tests that are on the market now. Since they can detect THC for an extremely long time, or THC metabolites for an extremely long time, you do not want to rely on these as any measure of impairment, of course. And in places where cannabis is legal, the information provided by a THC hair test is really going to be of limited value. Last testing type is impairment detection technology, and I'll talk mostly about Gaze in the context of this because that's our company, and we use eye movement to look for impairment. So impairment detection technology is a new category of device that looks at how the body is actually responding to a substance rather than looking for the substance. And this is important because of this phenomenon of the amount of the drug in the body not being correlated to impairment. Alcohol is really the only drug that works so cleanly for. For every other drug type, they're binding to receptors in the brain, they are behaving in different ways in the body, and so simply measuring the amount of the substance in the body cannot give you a clear answer as to whether or not someone is experiencing impairment from that drug. So that's why impairment detection technology has come to market. It's a really interesting new category, and it looks for, again, the signs of impairment that are manifesting in the body rather than the chemical that is causing the impairment. So Gaze is an eye movement test for impairment. It works by putting the test subject through a controlled and automated test that requires them to track a stimulus in a VR headset. And so they simply watch a ball move across the screen. We measure their gaze vector, their pupil size, at an extremely high rate and extremely high precision. What we're looking for are certain micro movements of the eye and pupillary reflexes that are consistent with impairment. And that can be for cannabis or basically any other category of drug. Each category of drug has a unique way in which impairment manifests in the eyes, and so we can really start to hone in on which category is causing this impairment as well. Using advanced statistical and machine learning algorithms to analyze that data that we capture in real time, we're able to extremely accurately determine if we're finding signs that could be consistent with impairment in our test data. Now, this testing type is the least invasive in that we are not capturing any bodily sample. We're simply watching your eyes move in accordance to how they should be moving, and results are available instantly. In our case, from the time you press the start test button to the time you have test results is about 6 minutes. So that allows for much higher throughput than any other testing type, and it also, again, tells you whether or not someone is showing signs of impairment rather than showing signs of prior use. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about impairment or the presence of THC. So driving under the influence of drugs and working under the influence of drugs is a growing factor in accidents, both driving accidents and workplace accidents. So with these accident rates increasing and business owners and law enforcement extremely concerned, we really need to find a way to discover impairment as it's being experienced from cannabis. The full legalization of marijuana, of course, is on the horizon for the United States. It's likely that we'll see that in the next couple of years. And legal access to cannabis is now available for the plurality of the United States population, as well as, of course, Canada and many other countries around the world. So knowing how long you can test positive for marijuana on a drug test is crucial information for a responsible cannabis user. And unlike alcohol, drug impairment testing is very challenging due to the lack of a universal impairment limit that can determine whether or not you're unsafe to be driving or working. So that limit has simply not been established by governments of the world, with a few notable exceptions. And again, I'm going to say that there is no amount of THC in the body that is predictive of impairment. So here's what you need to know about marijuana, the history of drug testing, THC, and marijuana laws in the United States. If you're still testing positive for cannabis on a chemical drug test, but haven't smoked in weeks or months, that's not terribly surprising, unfortunately. THC and THC metabolite tests are very sensitive, and these chemicals have a very long half-life in the body. Drug testing services companies are familiar with this phenomenon, and responsible ones will commonly warn their customers who are employers about it. The bottom line, though, is that marijuana users can easily fail a saliva or oral fluid test for 48 hours since their last use, and up to 8 days in some cases. That's shocking, of course. These are billed as recent use tests, and active THC in the saliva for over a week completely blows the idea that these are recent use tests out of the water. Urinalysis tests can be positive for much longer, although they're not billed as recent use tests and simply looking at prior use. These tests can be positive for, as I said, up to 60 days, sometimes 4 months, and it's critical to understand this and then look at impairment detection technology as a safe and legal alternative to traditional chemical drug testing. Now, drug testing got common in 1971 when ordered by President Richard Nixon shortly after the Vietnam War. The idea was that the military needed to start doing a urine drug testing program because they'd seen high rates of substance use during the war. The new program resulted in very high drug positivity rates among returning military personnel, which led to the Department of Defense ordering drug testing requirements and defining drug testing requirements. Now, each of the branches of the armed service then established groups of active duty scientists for the development and implementation of drug testing procedures. Thanks to the popularization of drug testing in the military, Quest Diagnostics then began performing employer drug tests in the mid-1980s and released the first drug testing index shortly after. This index examined the positivity rates to provide an analysis of drug use trends. In January of 1988, the first drug testing index was published, and it resulted in a drug positivity rate of 13.6%. During the same year, both Drug-Free Workplace Act and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act were passed by Congress. This was followed by several drug and alcohol-related accidents, the worst being a fatal train accident with the operator testing positive for marijuana. The federally mandated drug testing, along with a growing number of testing providers, led to testing among private sector employees. State regulatory agencies then established guidelines for testing because of the increased awareness, and the Omnibus Transportation Employee Drug Testing Act was passed in 1991, which required the U.S. Department of Transportation, or DOT, to test its applicants and employees. This was the first mandated drug testing required by law, and it required trucking, aviation, railroads, mass transit, pipelines, and other transportation-related industries to test their candidates and employees for alcohol and drugs. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, was established to help implement the Act in 1992. Its mission was to reduce substance abuse and mental illness in U.S. communities. Over time, the SAMHSA 5 has evolved to include marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, opioids, and phencyclidine. The DOT guidelines require all drug testing to be lab-based and to include marijuana. This was the foundation for today's drug testing, meant to prevent impairment in the workplace. The SAMHSA 5 led to zero tolerance policies, which worked when marijuana and other Schedule I drugs were illegal to use. When the first U.S. states legalized marijuana for recreational use in 2012, the zero tolerance approach started to become ineffective as the record low positivity rates for marijuana between 2010 to 2012 at 3.5% rose to a 16-year high in 2019. In most U.S. states and many other countries around the world, testing positive for THC can't prove illegal or inappropriate behavior in today's workplace. Now, some background on THC and drug tests. Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, is the main mind-altering chemical in marijuana, responsible for most of its intoxicating effects. The duration that marijuana remains in a person's system varies depending upon several factors, including the amount of THC used, the frequency of use, the hydration and metabolism of the person, the sensitivity of the drug test, how much body fat the person has, and other metabolic factors. Each of these factors can impact the period of time that THC is present in the body and therefore have an impact on drug test results. Importantly, THC is lipophilic, meaning that it readily binds to fat in the body and then is slowly re-released into the bloodstream over time. The THC that gets released by fat in the body is non-psychoactive, meaning that it will not cause a high in the user. This THC is what gets detected in most drug tests, though, which is why testing for THC and THC metabolites in the body is not a reliable way to measure impairment. Drug tests are used to screen for marijuana use and to help detect drug use, impairment, intoxication, and/or an overdose. They are also used to monitor drug abuse as well as compliance with prescription drugs. Detectable amounts of THC may remain in the body for weeks after marijuana was last used. THC is usually detectable for up to a month in blood, 24 to 48 hours in saliva, 4 weeks or longer in urine, and up to 4 months in hair. In comparison, drugs such as alcohol may disappear in just a few hours and are metabolized linearly, matching the experienced impairment. This is why alcohol breathalyzers and alcohol blood tests are effective ways to detect impairment. THC is primarily broken down by the liver. The byproducts created by the breakdown are cleared through the urine. This is not the same for THC stored in the body tissue, however, as it is continually released into the bloodstream over time. It repeats the cycle of getting broken down by the liver and cleared in the urine until it is depleted from the body. Metabolites typically appear in urine within 60 minutes following a dose of THC, but this process can take up to 4 hours in some cases. These metabolites appear in urine for a period of time that is dependent on the frequency of use and other factors already discussed. Marijuana laws are some of the most controversial in the United States. The federal government classifies marijuana as a Schedule I narcotic, meaning drugs that lack a currently accepted medical use while also having a high potential for abuse. Of course, marijuana is not a narcotic and certainly does have medical uses, but we'll get to that later. Marijuana is legal for adult recreational use in some states and decriminalized or made legal for medical use in other states. The states where adult recreational use and medical use of marijuana are legal varies all the time, and so I'm not going to list them here, but you can look those up on your own. Today there are 4 common drug tests for a workplace: pre-employment, post-accident, random, and reasonable suspicion. Pre-employment is typically done after a job offer is made but before the new hire starts working. This type of testing is becoming much less common, particularly in states that have legal marijuana, and in some states, pre-employment testing for THC is not even legal. The exception is that for positions where safety or security is critical, there's commonly an exception that's made in the law. Positions that include regulation or funding from the U.S. government also do require pre-employment testing, and that includes marijuana, even if it's in a marijuana legal state. And that'll, of course, change if the federal government reschedules or deschedules cannabis. Post-accident testing is required after an accident to determine if impairment could be blamed for the accident, especially one that causes injuries or fatalities. Random drug testing is when employees are selected at random for unannounced drug testing. Some employers still require this, though many are moving away from it, and in some states it's not legal. Reasonable suspicion is when employers are showing signs of impairment at work and an employer suspects that they could be under the influence of a substance and decides to test them for that. Pre-employment is the most common screening method, and in most states this type of testing is allowed. However, some require employers to give notice to applicants. Pre-employment drug testing has been ruled by courts as not representing medical examinations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and so there's no protections afforded under that. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, however, states that such tests should be conducted after an offer of employment is made, as the employer may need to ask about the candidate's medical history. It's also easier to not hire someone who failed a drug test rather than fire an employee who is already trained and part of the company. So businesses with safety-sensitive employees may want to conduct these and ongoing screenings after the worker is hired to make sure that employees are driving and operating machinery in particular are deterred from using drugs. The downside to cannabis screening in the workplace is that in states where it's legal, it precludes an employee from safely using their substance responsibly in their off time. This is like telling someone that you can't have a beer after work, and so employees are starting to push back on these requirements from their employers. The primary concern is that all current marijuana tests are retroactive. That is, they only measure past use, not active impairment, which is why we created GAZE, which is an automated version of the drug recognition expert tests that measure eye movement, and we use machine learning to detect impairment. So in conclusion, marijuana impairment is extremely complex and it's difficult to detect accurately. Classic chemical drug tests look for THC and THC metabolites in the body by evaluating typically a fluid like blood, saliva, in some cases breath or hair. These tests are fine in places where cannabis is illegal, but you don't want to deploy them in places where cannabis is legal lest you prevent someone from safely using a legal substance. For situations that require knowing if someone is currently impaired by marijuana, eye movement testing using our product GAZE is the most accurate testing that we know of today. And I'd love to chat with you about that if you'd like to get in touch. Just visit our website, gaze.ai.